Child labor refers to the employment of children in any work that deprives children of their childhood, interferes with their ability to attend regular school, and that is mentally, physically, socially and morally dangerous and harmful. This practice is considered exploitative by many international organizations. Legislation across the world prohibit child labor. These laws do not consider all work by children as child labor. Exceptions include work by child artists, family duties, supervised training, certain categories of work such as those by Amish children, some forms of child work common among indigenous American children, and others. Child labor has existed to varying extents through most of history. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, many children aged 5 to 14 from poorer families still worked in Europe, the United States and various colonies of European powers. These children mainly worked in agriculture, home-based assembly operations, factories, mining and in services such as newsboys. Some worked night shifts lasting 12 hours. With the rise of household income, availability of schools and passage of child labor laws, the incidence rates of child labor fell. In developing countries with high poverty and poor schooling opportunities, child labor is still prevalent. In 2010, sub-Saharan Africa had the highest incidence rates of child labor, with several African nations witnessing over 50% of children aged 5 to 14 working. Worldwide, agriculture is the largest employer of child labor. Vast majority of child labor is found in rural settings and informal urban economy. Children are predominantly employed by the parents, rather than factories. Poverty and lack of schools are considered as the primary cause of child labor. Globally, the incidence of child labor decreased from 25% to 10% between 1960 and 2003, according to the World Bank. Nevertheless, the total number of child laborers remains high, with UNICEF and ILO acknowledging an estimated 168 million children aged 5 to 17 worldwide were involved in child labor in 2013. History. Child labor in pre-industrial societies. Child labor forms an intrinsic part of pre-industrial economies. In pre-industrial societies, there is rarely a concept of childhood in the modern sense. Children often begin to actively participate activities such as child-rearing, hunting and farming as soon as they are competent. In many societies, children as young as 13 are seen as adults and engage in the same activities as adults. The work of children was important in pre-industrial societies, as children needed to provide their labor for the survival and that of their group. Pre-industrial societies were characterized by low productivity and short life expectancy. Preventing children from participating in productive work would be more harmful to the welfare and that of the group in the long run. In pre-industrial societies, there was little need for children to attend school. This is especially the case in non-literate societies. Most pre-industrial skill and knowledge were amenable to being passed down through direct mentoring or apprenticing by competent adults. The Industrial Revolution. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the late 18th century, there was a rapid increase in the industrial exploitation of labor, including child labor. Industrial cities such as Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool rapidly grew from small villages into large cities and improving child mortality rates. These cities drew in the population that was rapidly growing due to increased agricultural output. This was process replicated in other industrializing counties. The Victorian era in particular became notorious for the conditions under which children were employed. Children as young as 4 were employed in production factories and mines working long hours in dangerous, or often fatal, working conditions. In coal mines, children would crawl through tunnels too narrow and low for adults. Children also worked as errand boys, crossing sweepers, shoe blacks, or selling matches, flowers and other cheap goods. Some children undertook work as apprentices to respectable trades, such as building, or as domestic servants. Working hours were long. Builders worked 64 hours a week in summer and 52 in winter, while domestic servants worked 80-hour weeks. Child labor played an important role in the Industrial Revolution from its outset, often brought about by economic hardship. The children of the poor were expected to contribute to the family income. In 19th-century Great Britain, one-third of poor families were without a breadwinner as a result of death or abandonment, obliging many children to work from a young age. In England and Scotland in 1788, two-thirds of the workers in 143 water-powered cotton mills were described as children. A high number of children also worked as prostitutes. The author Charles Dickens worked at the age of 12 in a blacking factory, with his family in debtor's prison. Child wages were often low, as little as 10 to 20% of an adult male's wage. Karl Marx was an outspoken opponent of child labor, saying British industries could but live by sucking blood, and children's blood too, and that U.S. capital was financed by the capitalized blood of children. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, child labor began to decline in industrialized societies due to regulation and economic factors. The regulation of child labor began from the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution. The first act to regulate child labor in Britain was passed in 1803. As early as 1802 and 1819 Factory Acts were passed to regulate the working hours of workhouse children in factories and cotton mills to 12 hours per day. These acts were largely ineffective, and after radical agitation by, for example, the Short Time Committees in 1831, a royal commission recommended in 1833 that children aged 11 to 18 should work a maximum of 12 hours per day, children aged 9–11 a maximum of 8 hours, and children under the age of 9 were no longer permitted to work. This act, however, only applied to the textile industry, and further agitation led to another act in 1847 limiting both adults and children to 10-hour working days. Lord Shaftesbury was an outspoken advocate of regulating child labor. As technology improved and proliferated, there was a greater need for educated employees. This saw an increase in schooling, with the eventual introduction of compulsory schooling. Improved technology and automation also made child labor redundant. In the early 20th century, thousands of boys were employed in glass-making industries. Glass-making was a dangerous and tough job, especially without the current technologies. The process of making glass includes intense heat to melt glass. When the boys are at work, they are exposed to this heat. This could cause eye trouble, lung ailments, heat exhaustion, cut, and burns. Since workers were paid by the piece, they had to work productively 4 hours without a break. Since furnaces had to be constantly burning, there were night shifts from 5 p.m. to 3 a.m. Many factory owners preferred boys under 16 years of age. An estimated 1.7 million children under the age of 15 were employed in American industry by 1900. In 1910, over 2 million children in the same age group were employed in the United States. This included children who rolled cigarettes, engaged in factory work, worked as bob and offers in textile mills, worked in coal mines and were employed in canneries. Louis Hines' photographs of child laborers in the 1910s powerfully evoked the plight of working children in the American South. Hines took these photographs between 1908 and 1917 as the staff photographer for the National Child Labor Committee. Household enterprises, factories and mines were not the only places where child labor was prevalent in the early 20th century. Home-based manufacturing across the United States and Europe employed children as well. Governments and reformers argued that labor in factories must be regulated and the state had an obligation to provide welfare for poor. Legislation that followed had the effect of moving work out of factories into urban homes. Families and women, in particular, preferred it because it allowed them to generate income while taking care of household duties. Home-based manufacturing operations were active year-round. Families willingly deployed their children in these income-generating home enterprises. In many cases, men worked from home. In France, over 58% of garment workers operated out of their homes. In Germany, the number of full-time home operations nearly doubled between 1882 and 1907, and in the United States, millions of families operated out of home 7 days a week, year-round to produce garments, shoes, artificial flowers, feathers, matchboxes, toys, umbrellas and other products. Children aged 5 to 14 worked alongside the parents. Home-based operations and child labor in Australia, Britain, Austria and other parts of the world was common. Rural areas similarly saw families deploying the children in agriculture. In 1946, Frieda Miller, then director of United States Department of Labor, told the International Labor Organization that these home-based operations offered low wages, long hours, child labor, unhealthy and unsanitary working conditions. 21st century child labor is still common in many parts of the world. Estimates for child labor vary. It ranges between 250 and 304 million, if children aged 5 to 17 involved in any economic activity are counted. If light occasional work is excluded, ILO estimates there were 153 million child laborers aged 5 to 14 worldwide in 2008. This is about 20 million less than ILO estimate for child laborers in 2004. Some 60% of the child labor was involved in agricultural activities such as farming, dairy, fisheries and forestry. Another 25% of child laborers were in service activities such as retail, hawking goods, restaurants, load and transfer of goods, storage, picking and recycling trash, polishing shoes, domestic help, and other services. The remaining 15% labored in assembly and manufacturing in informal economy, home-based enterprises, factories, mines, packaging salt, operating machinery, and such operations. 2 out of 3 child workers work alongside the parents in unpaid family work situations. Some children work as guides for tourists, sometimes combined with bringing in business for shops and restaurants. Child labor predominantly occurs in the rural areas and informal urban sector. Contrary to popular beliefs, most child laborers are employed by the parents rather than in manufacturing of formal economy. Children who work for pay or in-kind compensation are usually found in rural settings, then urban centers. Less than 3% of child labor aged 5 to 14 across the world work outside the household, or away from the parents. Child labor accounts for 22% of the workforce in Asia, 32% in Africa, 17% in Latin America, 1% in the US, Canada, Europe, Europe and other wealthy nations. The proportion of child laborers varies greatly among countries and even regions inside those countries. Africa has the highest percentage of children aged 5 to 17 employed as child labor, and a total of over 65 million. Asia, with its larger population, has the largest number of children employed as child labor at about 114 million. Latin America and Caribbean region have lower overall population density, but at 14 million child laborers has high incidence rates too. Accurate present-day child labor information is difficult to obtain because of disagreements between data sources as to what constitutes child labor. In some countries, government policy contributes to this difficulty. For example, the overall extent of child labor in China is unclear due to the government categorizing child labor data as highly secret. China has enacted regulations to prevent child labor. Still, the practice of child labor is reported to be a persistent problem within China, generally in agriculture and low-skill service sectors as well as small workshops and manufacturing enterprises. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Labor issued a list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor where China was attributed 12 goods, the majority of which were produced by both underage children and indentured laborers. The report listed electronics, garments, toys and coal among other goods. Maplecroft Child Labor Index 2012 survey reports 76 countries pose extreme child labor complicity risks for companies operating worldwide. The 10 highest risk countries in 2012, ranked in decreasing order, were Myanmar, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, DR Congo, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Burundi, Pakistan and Ethiopia. Of the major growth economies, Maplecroft ranked Philippines 25th riskiest, India 27th, China 36th, Vietnam 37th, Indonesia 46th, and Brazil 54th, all of them rated to involve extreme risks of child labor uncertainties. The corporations seeking to invest in developing world and import products from emerging markets. Causes of child labor. Primary causes. International Labour Organization suggests poverty is the greatest single cause behind child labor. For impoverished households, income from a child's work is usually crucial for his or her own survival or for that of the household. Income from working children, even if small, may be between 25 and 40% of the household income. Other scholars such as Harsh on African child labor and Edmonds and Packnick on global child labor have reached the same conclusion. Lack of meaningful alternatives, such as affordable schools and quality education, according to ILO, is another major factor driving children to harmful labor. Children work because they have nothing better to do. Many communities, particularly rural areas where between 60 to 70% of child labor is prevalent, do not possess adequate school facilities. Even when schools are sometimes available, they are too far away, difficult to reach, unaffordable, and the quality of education is so poor that parents wonder if going to school is really worth it. Cultural causes. In European history, when child labor was common, as well as in contemporary child labor of modern world, certain cultural beliefs have rationalized child labor and thereby encouraged it. Some view that work is good for the character building and skill development of children. In many cultures, particularly where the informal economy and small household businesses thrive, the cultural tradition is that children follow in the parents' footsteps. Child labor then is a means to learn and practice the trade from a very early age. Similarly, in many cultures the education of girls is less valued. The girls are simply not expected to need formal schooling, and these girls pushed into child labor such as providing domestic services. Macroeconomic causes. Bigari and Mehrotra have studied the macroeconomic factors that encourage child labor. They focus the study on 5 Asian nations including India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand and Philippines. They suggest that child labor is a serious problem in all 5, but it is not a new problem. Macroeconomic causes encourage widespread child labor across the world over most of human history. They suggest that the causes for child labor include both the demand and the supply side. While poverty and unavailability of good schools explain the child labor supply side, they suggest that the growth of low-paying informal economy rather than higher-paying formal economy is amongst the causes of the demand side. Other scholars too suggest that inflexible labor market, size of informal economy, inability of industries to scale up and lack of modern manufacturing technologies are major macroeconomic factors affecting demand and acceptability of child labor.